Hey guys, tonight we dig into something hot, ancient, and deeply underwhelming pottage. The smell wafts up before the sun does, thick and earthy like boiled moss in yesterday's socks. It clings to your tunic, your hair, your hopes. You're not dreaming of pastries or fruit or roast chicken. You're dreaming of whether the peas and turnips held up overnight, and whether today's pottage will be thin enough to slurp or thick enough to shovel. You wake up in 14th century England, or maybe it's France. Honestly, it doesn't matter. Both taste like root vegetables, and both sound like coughing and livestock. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, you're about to spend another day fueling your tired medieval body with what can only be described as vegetable-adjacent gray matter. This is pottage. And it's not so much a meal as it is a bubbling metaphor for your entire existence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know which century you currently feel like you're stuck in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your eyes open slowly. The first thing you notice is your spine, it hurts. Then your nose, it's cold. Then your stomach, it's loud. Already making demands no one intends to meet. You're lying on something that was once straw and now qualifies as organic floor insulation. The blanket is a coarse wool wrap that smells vaguely like damp sheep. Because it once was a damp sheep. The ceiling leaks, the floor leaks. Your joints creak louder than the shutters. You roll over and try to remember if today is a feast day. It's not, which means pottage. Again, you hear the wooden spoon scraping the sides of the pot before you even sit up. Someone's already stirring. The pot is the most important object in the household. Not the Bible, not the bed, the pot. It's cast iron, slightly dented. And it's the only thing keeping your entire family from dissolving into hunger-induced hallucinations. You trudge outside. The communal fire pit is already smoky. The pot bubbles like it's keeping secrets. You can smell the turnips, always the turnips. They're not sweet, they're not bitter. They just are, like time or guilt. Your sister is crouched beside the pot, stirring with the sacred communal spoon. No one speaks. Everyone's watching the sludge like it might do a trick. It won't. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Pottage was the staple meal for peasants in medieval England and France. From the 13th to 15th centuries, it was made by boiling grains like barley or oats with whatever vegetables were on hand, mostly onions, leeks, cabbage, and turnips. Herbs were rare, meat was a miracle, salt was political, and flavor was optional. But here's a quirkier truth. Pottage wasn't just one meal, it was every meal. You didn't cook pottage, you just kept it going. It simmered for days. Bits were added as available roots, wild greens, yesterday's bread. It was culinary recycling long before that was trendy. Historians still argue whether pottage was nutritious genius or just edible despair. Some praise its use of whatever was on hand. Others say it was a slow, joyless march toward malnutrition. But most agree on one thing: it kept people alive. Barely. Impressively, tragically. You peer into the pot today. Someone's added barley, that's new. Fancy, someone else tried to grind dried peas into mush but ended up with green clumps that float like ghosts of failed seasoning. There's a shred of cabbage swirling ominously near the edge. You take your spoon and wait. The trick is to dip in after the scum floats up, but before the oatmeal at the bottom turns to glue. It's a delicate art. One that you never wanted to master, but here you are, Michelangelo with a ladle. You finally eat. It's hot, bland. It sticks to your tongue like guilt and bread crusts. You don't taste vegetables so much as remember them. It fills your belly just enough to dull the growl, but not enough to grant satisfaction. It's not a meal, it's a truce. And you'll be back for more by nightfall. You wake again later that same morning, not because you were sleeping, really, but because that half snooze where your eyes close against the smoke doesn't count as rest. Your back still aches from the lumpy straw mat. and your breath mists as you exhale, which would be beautiful if it weren't a sign of just how cold it is inside your own house. You peel off the wool wrap and feel your joints complain, like they've aged a decade overnight. You're 22, which means you're already middle-aged by local standards. Congratulations, you've outlived the family goat. The pot outside is still simmering. You can hear the faint glug 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 that tells you breakfast is technically being made. The good news, you don't have to think about what to eat. The bad news, it's pottage. Again, no surprises, no variations, just different consistencies of hot sadness. You shuffle outside into the cold grayness of the morning. The sun has made no promises today, just a faint glow behind a curtain of clouds. You step around puddles that are neither water nor mud, but something more existential. A child is crying somewhere and a chicken is loudly confused. You're not sure which one is closer to your emotional state. The communal fire pit smolders. A few other villagers are already gathered near it. They look like you hunched, bleary-eyed, and chewing nothing in anticipation of chewing something. You squat near the pot and stare at it. It stares back, bubbling like it knows something you don't. Today's pottage is thin, probably too much water added after yesterday's ladle-scraped bottom. You can see onion skins floating on the surface like medieval confetti. There's a hint of turnip again, because there's always turnip. If vegetables were flavors of sadness, turnip would be melancholy, parsnip would be regret, and cabbage would be despair's soggy cousin. You take your place in the line and wait. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Peasants in medieval France and England often shared large communal pots within their homes or even small neighborhoods. Fuel was scarce, so food was often cooked once and reheated over and over. A single pot might serve as breakfast, lunch and dinner topped off as needed with water, herbs or anything recently foraged or regrettably found behind the chicken shed. You finally receive your serving, a slosh of gray-brown mystery ladled into a wooden bowl that leaks slightly if you tilt it wrong. It's lukewarm, textured like mud, and smells faintly of yesterday's socks. You take a bite, it's edible, barely. Your sister says nothing as she eats beside you. No one talks during pottage. There's no reason to... What could you possibly say? I do believe the leek adds a floral bitterness to the mud notes, no. You just eat. And then there's the fringe fact some pottage was intentionally kept simmering for weeks. It was never fully cleaned out. Instead, old pottage was mixed with new ingredients, creating what might optimistically be called flavor layering. What it really meant, though, was that on any given day, your bowl might contain remnants of a beetroot from 2 weeks ago, a barley kernel from last Thursday, and someone's mistake from a full moon ago. Historians still argue whether this was a survival technique or a health hazard wearing a cloak of tradition. You find a small, chewy chunk in your bowl. You don't ask questions, you don't want answers. You chew, swallow, and move on. That's the pottage way. The meal ends quickly. You wipe the bowl with the end of your sleeve, not for cleanliness, but because there's no such thing as a napkin. The smoke has settled into your clothes, and your hair feels crispy at the edges. A child scrapes the bottom of the pot with a stick. You don't stop them. It's fair game. The pot is rinsed out with cold water and more firewood is added. It will bubble all day, patiently transforming scraps into dinner. Again, there's no breakfast menu, no variation, just different shades of survival. You walk back to your shack, stomach slightly less hollow, and pause. You glance back at the pot, still steaming, still waiting. You will return, because in the 13th century, hunger doesn't knock. It camps outside and waits for your spoon. Later that day, you find yourself staring into the pot again. The sun is higher now, but that doesn't mean warmer. Light filters through clouds like a guilty apology, and the wind reminds you that your clothes have exactly one job: fail to keep you warm. The pot is still bubbling. Of course it is. It always is. And you're about to add something to it, which means it's time to play history's slowest game of will this kill me. You squat beside the hearth, spoon in hand, and peer inside. The surface is murky with greenish wisps of boiled leaf clinging to the rim like tired flags. You can make out a turnip stub, a few grains of barley, and something that might be a bean or might be a rock. You reach into your apron pouch and drop in a prize, 2 wilted leeks, and a small parsnip. High cuisine, by medieval standards. This is the kind of meal people write ballads about if those people are cold, hungry, and deeply sarcastic. Let's be clear, pottage isn't a recipe, it's more of an ongoing edible situation. There is no start, there is only what's left. You throw in whatever you have. Pray it doesn't float in a suspicious way, and wait. Here's your mainstream historical fact: medieval pottage was a flexible, evolving stew that adapted to the seasons, the harvest, and the cook's luck. Spring meant wild herbs, summer gave peas, autumn brought root vegetables, and winter gave, turnips, always turnips, no matter the season. The goal was the same: fill the belly and keep the fire alive. You stir slowly, watching a chunk of something bob to the surface, and it might be cabbage. It might be regret. You prod it with the spoon. It sinks. Good enough. A neighbor appears, holding a handful of chopped onion skins and something that used to be bread. She adds it to the pot without a word, and you both nod solemnly in unspoken agreement that yes, this is dinner, and yes, we're pretending it's food. Let's pause for a moment and enjoy a fringe historical tidbit. There were people who deliberately added stale bread, called sops, into pottage to make it thicker and heartier. Sometimes that bread had mold, sometimes it had weevils. Either way, it was considered an upgrade: extra calories, extra bulk, and just a hint of existential dread. Historians still argue whether this was culinary resourcefulness or a slow descent into gastrointestinal purgatory. You drop a cracked egg into the pot and whisper a tiny blessing just in case. The shell floats, you pretend not to notice. The fire crackles. The smoke stings your eyes. The air smells of boiled leek, old wool, and slightly burned hope. There's no seasoning. Salt is expensive. Pepper is mythical. If you're lucky. Someone might toss in a sprig of something green that isn't poisonous. If you're unlucky, someone might toss in something they think is green and not poisonous. It's a gamble every time. The pot thickens slightly as it boils. You stir like your life depends on it, which it sort of does. If it burns, dinner becomes an ash-flavored disaster. If it boils over, you'll be scraping oat glue off the hearth for hours. And if it explodes, well, at least you'll be warm for a few seconds. And then there's the meat debate. If you're rich, you can throw in salted pork or dried fish. If you're not, and you're definitely not, you hope for bone. Not meat on bone, just the bone. For flavor, which it barely gives, unless the marrow is still clinging to life and has decided to share its secrets. You found a bone once, you still think about it. A dog bark echoes through the village. Somewhere. Someone's yelling about firewood, a baby wails, you keep stirring. Because in this life, the pot never stops. It feeds you, it defines your day, it offers warmth, weight, and disappointment in equal measure. Pottage isn't a dish, it's a lifestyle. And like the weather, the fleas, and the ever-present ache in your knees, it's always there. By afternoon, the pot has entered what villagers affectionately call its bubbling sludge phase. It's not quite soup, it's not quite mash, it's more like edible mud with ideas. You've stirred it 5 times already today, you're going to stir it again. Not because it needs it, but because it gives you the illusion that you're doing something productive while living in a time without central heating, sanitation, or dreams. Smoke curls upward from the hearth like a warning. The firewood is damp again because of course it is so. The flames hiss and sputter like they're offended by your existence. You crouch low, eyes watering, and poke the coals until the pot resumes its signature death rattle simmer. You lift the lid. The smell punches you gently in the face: boiled greens, old garlic, and that uniquely medieval scent of "we tried our best." You sigh, wipe your eyes on your sleeve, and reach for the ladle. Here's your mainstream fact: most peasant homes had 1 pot, 1 fire, and 0 insulation. Cooking was done low to the ground, often on an open hearth. Chimneys weren't standard yet, so smoke filled the house, clinging to clothes, eyes, and lungs. Ventilation was a luxury feature that consisted of cracks in the walls and holes in the roof. You were breathing dinner before you even ate it. You dipped the ladle in. The consistency has thickened. Yesterday's oats have formed small clumps that drift like sad dumplings. And today's cabbage is melting into the broth. You chew with your eyes. You imagine what it might taste like if someone had been careless enough to drop in a chunk of salt pork. You don't see any. You sigh again. Now for your quirky tidbit in some villages. People believed the pot should never be fully emptied, as that would break its spirit. The superstition said if you scraped the bottom too clean, the pot would curse you with thin meals and broken lids. So most households left just a spoonful at the bottom, a kind of culinary compost that became the base for the next day's blend. You're not superstitious, but you still leave a scoop behind, just in case. You turn to check the coals again. One has rolled out and scorched a line across the dirt floor. You stomp it out with your foot, which is wrapped in linen because shoes are for rich people or saints. Your big toe is cold, your patience is colder. You hear a chicken pecking near the pot. You make eye contact with it. It stares at you. It knows you want to eat it. You both agree this isn't going to happen today. You shoo it away with the ladle and ladle yourself a bowl instead. It's the same wooden bowl you've used since you were 8. You've grown. The bowl has not. It holds about 3 sad spoonfuls of sustenance. You sip. It's hot. It has texture. It tastes vaguely of vegetables, though it's hard to tell which ones. You bite down on something firm. It's either a pea or a miscalculation, and still you eat. Because this is your life, not a feast, not a famine, just a constant parade of barely warm, nearly edible slop. You finish your bowl and rinse it with water that may or may not be clean. You use your sleeve to dry it. Hygiene is more of a hope than a system. Back at the pot, the lid clunks into place, the fire hisses. The smoke swirls upward and settles again in your hair. Historians still argue whether the constant cooking of pottage represented efficiency, monotony, or quiet resistance to starvation. Some say it kept families alive. Others say it symbolized the slow boil of peasant misery under feudal rule. You think it's both. And now it's time to start chopping for dinner. The cycle never ends. The pot doesn't sleep, and neither do you, not really. Evening creeps in like a cold draft through your cracked wall, and once again it's pottage o'clock. The hearth glows dimly with the last effort of a dying fire, and you hunch beside the pot, back sore from a day of bending, chopping, hauling, and thinking about the 7,000 other bowls of pottage you've had in your life. The fire pops. A spark lands on your tunic, which is mostly holes held together by soot and disappointment. You pat it out with a seasoned hand. The pot is darker now. The longer it cooks, the murkier it gets. It has entered the stage of existential stew. There's something floating that might have been a carrot in its youth, and something else that's gelatinous. You ladle carefully. You don't want to trigger anything. Supper is served. This is where things get social, or at least medieval social, which means several people silently chewing while trying not to look too sad. Everyone has their bowl. Everyone eats with a wooden spoon or their fingers if the spoon was lost or borrowed indefinitely. You don't talk, you chew slowly, mechanically, trying not to chip a tooth on an overcooked barley lump. And here's a historical fact to chew on table manners. As we know them didn't exist. There were no forks, there was no personal space. People shared bowls, hands, breath, and occasionally a drop of cough into the pot. Nobles had servants to slice meat and wipe their faces. Peasants had sleeves, and even the cleanest sleeves still had traces of chicken coop. Your little brother slurps loudly. Your sister picks a stringy bit out of her teeth. You find a clump of something chewy and unplaceable. You eat it anyway. It's not good, but it's food, probably. Then comes the unspoken ritual, the bottom scrape. Once everyone's had their share, someone, usually the hungriest, gets to scrape whatever's left. This person is either lucky or cursed. Today, it's you. You scrape, you get sludge. Conglomerated oat cement with turnip particles and an onion shard. It could power a small village or permanently seal a stone wall. You eat it. Let's take a moment to talk class differences, because while you're scraping oat tar off the pot, the nobility is feasting upstairs in their smoky great halls. But don't envy them too quickly. Here's your fringe tidbit: pottage was not just a peasant dish. Nobles ate it too, often called frumenti or mortrus, jazzed up with spices and meats and things peasants couldn't spell, let alone taste. But even those fancy versions sat next to questionable meat pies and fish that had been preserved a bit too enthusiastically. Historians still argue whether noble diets were luxurious or just a more expensive way to get food poisoning. You'll stick with your mystery oat goo. Thanks. You finish the last bite. It's gritty, not from spice, from actual grit. Then comes cleanup. You don't wash the pot. You rinse it, sort of. Maybe a handful of water, maybe a rag if someone hasn't repurposed it for shoe padding. But fully cleaning the pot, no way, because if you strip it down, you lose the base flavor, the ancient, deeply embedded seasoning of 1,000 previous meals. Some call it disgusting. You call it dinner. There's a rhythm to this life. Not a good rhythm, more like the rhythm of a cracked drum being beaten underwater. But it's familiar. Stir, sip, survive. You glance at the pot one more time. Tomorrow's batch will start soon. Probably with the last third of an onion and whatever herbs someone forgot to steal from the monastery garden. It won't be good, but it will be there. And in this world, that's everything. Let's pretend, just for fun, that you weren't a dirt-smeared peasant. Let's say you're upstairs, somewhere in a stone hall that smells like roasted meat and wet dog, with a tunic too tight and a goblet too heavy. You're a noble now. Congratulations. Enjoy your gout. You look down the long table lit by candles and crushed hopes. A jester's doing something embarrassing in the corner. The meat is overcooked. The fish is undercooked. And someone nearby is definitely going to die from whatever is inside that pie. But at least you're not eating pottage. Right, well, sort of. Because here's the catch: nobles didn't avoid pottage. They just disguised it. Yours is called mortrus, made with ground meats and expensive spices if the trade routes are functioning and the merchant didn't drown. It's thicker, richer, browner, still unphotogenic, still soupy. You dip trenchers of stale bread into it, because forks won't exist for another few centuries. The bread acts as a plate, or a sponge, or a sad gesture toward hygiene. And now for the mainstream fact: while the peasantry relied on pottage for every meal, nobles consumed pottage-like dishes too, often with wheat instead of barley, eggs if they could be spared, and animal products to elevate the slop into dining. It wasn't haute cuisine, it was medieval oatish. A servant passes you a dish of something that might be liver, might be pigeon, and definitely smells like old courage. It's buried in a puddle of spiced mush. You smile faintly and pretend to enjoy it. Because in this world, the performance is half the meal. The table groans under the weight of bread loaves that could shatter windows, meat pies bubbling with mysterious intentions, and gravy boats filled with lukewarm treachery. Across from you, a noblewoman dabs her mouth with a cloth napkin that has never been washed. Her hands are covered in rings. Her teeth are not present. You begin to miss your turnip-stained bowl. Here's your fringe tidbit: medieval noble kitchens sometimes served pottage that included almond milk, sugar, and dried fruits, especially during fast days when meat was forbidden. The result was a sticky, sweet porridge-adjacent thing that no one really enjoyed, but everyone agreed was appropriate. Historians still argue whether it was a delicacy or just a fancy punishment for being too rich to be hungry. And of course, everything is lukewarm. Why? Because the kitchens are far away from the dining hall. Your food traveled a mile uphill through freezing air and underpaid boys before it arrived. By the time it hits your trencher, it's the temperature of apathy. The lord of the manor slaps his belly and demands wine. He slurs a story about a wild boar that ends with someone vomiting in the rushes. A dog licks a dripping spoon and no one stops it. The minstrels play something too jaunty for the smell in the room. And you, noble peasant for a day, realize something extraordinary. The food is worse. At least your pottage didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It was humble, hot, and consistent. These dishes, they're pride-wearing mold. They're a flex in the form of indigestion. You sip some ale. It's warm and tastes like bitter socks. You miss your communal pot, your smoke-scented hearth, your onion chunk that tasted like yesterday. Historians still argue whether noble meals represented status or just masochism with gravy. The flavors were bold, yes, but so were the parasites. Food was power, display, and sometimes death. You excuse yourself politely. You walk back toward the kitchens where the air is thick with soot, yelling, and barley. The servants are huddled around a second pot. One ladles out a bowl of peasant pottage with a grin. You take a bite, and for the first time all day it tastes honest. But not every pot of pottage is a quiet miracle. Sometimes the pot turns. Literally, the fire goes out, the barley ferments. Someone adds a questionable mushroom from behind the privy. And suddenly your humble stew is less nourishment and more dinner with consequences. It starts with a smell, not the usual boiled sadness. This one is sharper, sourer, like if vinegar and regret had a baby. You lift the lid and immediately regret your life choices. The pot has developed a thin skin of mystery. You prod it with a spoon. It jiggles back, as if daring you. Here's your mainstream fact: food poisoning in the Middle Ages wasn't just unpleasant, it was often fatal. Without refrigeration, clear hygiene standards, or anyone to tell you not to reboil the same mixture for 5 days straight, pottage could become a bacterial cocktail. Medieval people didn't know about salmonella, but they did know the symptoms: sweating, cramping, vomiting into a ditch, and asking your priest if your soul was still redeemable. And now, for your daily weird, there are historical mentions, half real, half whispered, that some communities believed spoiled pottage was the work of evil spirits or fairies, especially if the stew hummed or bubbled without heat. One woman was accused of cursing the pot after a particularly gassy batch made half her village ill. Historians still argue whether this was legitimate fear or a convenient excuse to exile someone who owed 3 chickens. You're not sure what's wrong with today's batch, but it looks alive, and no one's hungry enough to test it. So the pot is taken outside and dumped behind the thatched hut, where even the pigs sniff and walk away. That's when you know it's serious. So what do you do when pottage fails? You scavenge. You and your siblings head to the woods. You gather sorrel, dandelion greens, maybe a limp carrot if the earth is generous. You avoid mushrooms, mostly, unless you want to wake up seeing demons, or not at all. One boy found a rabbit last week. That rabbit is now a story because it fed 10 and left everyone licking fingers like they'd just discovered flavor. Back at home, someone found a small bone, maybe pork, maybe not. It's thrown in with wild herbs and a splash of rainwater. You restart the pot, whispering small apologies to the gods of digestion. It simmers again. The new batch looks better. You add stale bread to thicken it. You add a turnip because of course you do. You always add a turnip. At this point, you're convinced they're self-replicating. You eat carefully, slowly, waiting for that gut feeling, not the metaphorical kind, the is this safe kind. So far, so good. But then your neighbor stumbles over, pale as linen. He mutters that his wife can't stop vomiting, that their pot was off, that the cat refused it, and that the cat eats leather boots. You nod, you know the signs. Sometimes dinner just tries to kill you. There are no doctors, only healers, who wave herbs and chant blessings and occasionally tell you to bleed into a bowl because your humors are unbalanced. The village wise woman offers mint leaves and tells you to lie down on the clean straw, which is just regular straw with less mud. It's a slow wait, most survive, some don't. You're lucky. Today's pottage only numbed your taste buds, not your organs. Historians still argue whether pottage's reputation as a staple was due to its practicality or a lack of better options. Was it culinary genius, or was it simply the only thing left after the rats took the grain? Either way, you survive another night. The fire dies down, the pot goes silent, you wash your bowl in cold water and hang it by the wall. You sleep lightly, listening for the bubbling that will start again in the morning. Because in this house, the pot is never really empty, and tomorrow you stir again. Morning again. You open your eyes to the familiar orchestra of coughs, chickens, and someone sneezing directly into the rafters. Your first thought is not about the weather or work or whether today is a holy day, it's about the pot. You sit up slowly, joints cracking like poorly carved wood, and you sniff the air. Yes, it's bubbling again, like clockwork, or more accurately, like a biological trap set to simmer for eternity. The pottage is back in business. Someone's already added onion peels in yesterday's barley. It smells slightly better than despair. This isn't just food anymore. It's a full lifestyle commitment. You shuffle over to the fire. It's been restarted with damp twigs and dry curses. A fresh layer of scum circles the edge of the pot like a medieval aura. You stir with the big wooden spoon, the one that's seen 3 generations of your family and once doubled as a weapon in a neighborly feud. You glance down into the swirl of half-recognizable ingredients, and you realize you've eaten some form of this same pottage every single day for your entire life. Here's the mainstream fact: pottage wasn't just a meal, it was the meal. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was what fed you before a day of labor, what you collapsed into at dusk, and what you reheated when your guests arrived unannounced and undernourished. No holiday could escape it, even on feast days. You started with pottage, only maybe this time it had beans and a garnish, if you were lucky. And here's a fun historical tidbit. Some chroniclers describe pottage as so ever-present that entire communities could identify families by the smell of their pot, like medieval perfume. Ah yes, the Thompsons. Turnip and garlic again. Historians still argue whether this created neighborly pride or nose-based feuds. Your bowl is passed to you, and you sip. This morning's brew is thinner, more cabbage, less chew. It tastes of warm broth and distant memories. You've forgotten what fresh tastes like, but you remember comfort, and somehow this is it. Outside, the wind howls. You throw on your threadbare cloak, grab a basket, and head out to gather. Wild sorrel, nettles, a bruised apple if fortune smiles. Everything you find ends up in the pot. The pot does not discriminate. It welcomes herbs, scraps, roots, even the occasional accidental insect. You've stopped caring, and that's when it hits you. You're not just eating pottage, you're becoming it. You're predictable, durable, mildly flavored, reheated by necessity, and no matter what life throws into you, you just keep going. There's a strange peace in it. You return by noon, stir, sip, serve. Someone brings a fish head, an actual miracle, and it's promptly boiled into the mix. You imagine the fish's last thoughts as it's reduced to stock. Probably envy, that it's not you. Endlessly recycled in a medieval stew loop, and yet you survive. That's the magic of pottage. It doesn't make life better, but it keeps life going. It hums beneath your existence like the drone of bees or gossip, always present, never thrilling, relentlessly useful. Historians still argue whether the endless cycle of pottage dulled the medieval palate or created resilience in the face of scarcity. But you know the truth. Pottage made you into a survivor. You eat again, you swallow again, you sleep again, and tomorrow you stir again. Because in your world, the pot isn't just food, it's family, it's routine, it's forever. The years roll past like uneven wagon wheels. You barely notice the changing seasons anymore, except by the different weeds in the pot. Spring brings nettles. Summer means dried herbs and watery carrots. Autumn adds parsnips and sadness. Winter is cabbage and prayers. You are older now, not old just well used, like the ladle, like the pot. Your hands are more callous than skin. Your back curves slightly from decades of stirring. And your teeth, let's not talk about your teeth. You still chew, technically, but more in spirit than technique. And still, the pottage simmers. Always the same pot, always the same rhythm. Wake, stoke fire, add scraps, stir, serve, survive. A few of the younger ones sometimes complain, "Why can't we eat like the nobles?" they ask. You laugh, not kindly, not unkindly. Just the way someone laughs when they know how many nobles have died from spoiled goose or bread seasoned with rat poison disguised as cinnamon. Because here's the last mainstream fact: pottage, humble, bland, endlessly recycled, had one incredible advantage over much of noble cuisine: it was safe. Not always tasty, not exciting, but safe. It rarely killed you. And in a world where dining could literally be a game of plague roulette, safety was a luxury you could ladle. Still, even safety grows heavy when you carry it forever. You sit down one evening and realize something: you've eaten this meal more than 10,000 times. You've stirred the same pot every day for 4 decades. You could make pottage with your eyes closed, and sometimes you do. In your dreams, in your memories. Tonight, someone adds a single wrinkled plum. A miracle, a curiosity. It boils apart instantly, but the aroma lingers like incense from another world. You close your eyes and breathe it in. Just for a second, it almost feels like change. And here's your final fringe fact: there are written accounts, rare, wistful, oddly poetic, of people adding fruit, nuts, or even bits of honeycomb to celebratory pottage. Births, marriages, deaths. These moments were marked not by wine or cake, but by making the slop slightly less slop-like. Historians still argue whether that made pottage special or just proved there was nothing else left to elevate. The fire's low, the bowl is warm in your hands. It's not delicious, but it's not disgusting either. It's just familiar, like an old song, or a mild disappointment you've made peace with. Someone younger asks if you'll ever stop eating it. You smile, not unless someone invents the bakery. They laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's easier than crying over rutabaga. And so the night creeps in. The pot is covered, the fire banked with ash. The bowls are stacked rough, cracked, scorched by decades of use. You lay down in the same straw, with the same wool, and the same quiet hunger. And tomorrow, you'll stir again. Because in this world, you don't need variety. You need something that doesn't leave. You need pottage. You always have. You always will. Wind down 300 words. So now, as the pot cools and the embers fade into soft orange glimmers, let your mind quiet. You've stirred, scraped, sipped, and survived. You've eaten the same meal for so long. It became more than food, it became rhythm. And in that rhythm, there was something strangely safe, strangely comforting. It didn't matter if you were in France or England, a peasant or a servant, young or worn down by time. The pot was always there, bubbling, waiting, asking for nothing but a few scraps and a little patience. And somehow it gave you everything. Not joy, not satisfaction, not culinary brilliance, but continuity. Something warm in a cold world. Something edible in a place where not much else was. So tonight, as you settle beneath your blanket or whatever counts as one, let that simplicity hold you. Let the steam from the imaginary pot curl through your thoughts like a lullaby. Let the wooden spoon rest beside the hearth. Let the quiet repetition of life before flavor guide you gently into sleep. There's nothing more to stir, nothing more to add. Just this moment, just this warmth, just this silence. The pottage can wait until morning.
Hey guys, tonight we traveled to 14th century France, where the fires are smoky, the fleas are busy, and marriage laws have taken a very strange turn. You wake up not beside your spouse, not beside a farm animal, but beside a corpse, a very freshly dead man. He was your fiancé yesterday. Today, he's your legally approved husband. Surprise, you're married to a person who is no longer technically a person, You probably won't survive this century or this decade, honestly. But here's the good news. You're alive right now. The bad news. You're a woman in medieval France, and your future just got tangled in church law, royal decree, and a corpse that may or may not be dressed for a wedding. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing when and where history finds you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You just woke up in 1348. There's fog in the field, ash in the hearth, and the vague smell of mold in your straw bed. You sit up slowly. Your back aches like you're 50, but you're barely out of your teens. And lying beside you is a bundle wrapped in linen. Not your wedding dress, not your breakfast bread, but your dead fiancé. His name was Etienne. Yesterday, he had a cough. Today, he has rigor mortis. You're not crying. Not exactly. You're staring. Not because you're in shock, but because your family has already begun discussing the wedding. Yes, the wedding. The one you're still going to have. To the corpse. It sounds like a nightmare. But in 14th century France, this is a perfectly valid legal practice. It's called mariage posthume, or posthumous marriage. And yes, it's an actual thing. While relatively rare, it was practiced with just enough frequency and solemnity to be considered a respectable solution for inconvenient deaths. If the fiancé dies suddenly, especially if the woman is already pregnant, or the banns have been read, it's better to finish the marriage than deal with the shame. Here's the mainstream historical fact in medieval France. Social order and inheritance law were often more important than living participants. The Catholic Church didn't exactly endorse necromantic matrimony, but it didn't prohibit it either, not if it protected a woman's virtue, the legitimacy of her children, or the stability of family estates. The French crown itself would later codify the practice more formally in the 20th century, but its roots were planted much earlier. Here, in the humid, plague-prone mud of the 1300s, one famous fringe tale. A woman named Marguerite married her betrothed after he died in a duel because their child would otherwise be declared illegitimate. The priest performed the ceremony with a sword laid in the dead man's place because the body was no longer presentable, or maybe because no one wanted to hold the corpse upright for the vows. You understand. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were acts of love, coercion, or legal desperation. Some claim the brides insisted on them out of grief. Others say families forced them out of fear. And a few scholars wonder if posthumous marriages were part legal loophole, part psychological coping mechanism, one final attempt to impose meaning on an absurd, brutal life. Either way, it's happening to you now. You're pulled from bed. Etienne is cleaned, sort of. His fingers are laced with yours. Someone places a wreath of wilting herbs around your head. A priest clears his throat. No one asks if you're ready, only if the paperwork's done. You try not to gag when they place a ring on his cold finger. You don't kiss him. Thank goodness. But you are now Madame Etienne de la Rue, and legally respectable. You wake up again, this time in your new life. Same shack, same straw, same cold draft snaking down your spine. The only difference is that now you're married and a widow, all in the same 24 hours. Talk about a whirlwind romance. The priest may have mumbled something about eternal love, but your backache says otherwise. Your bed is nothing more than flattened straw inside a lopsided wooden frame, the kind that gives splinters and fleas. The blanket, a burlap sack someone thought was too itchy for potatoes. You shift a little, but every movement is a gamble. Will it be a spider? Or just another sharp stick waiting under the hay? Outside, the sun is not shining. It's leaking, like a broken lantern trying to rise through the mist. You can already hear the coughing. Everyone is coughing. Babies, dogs, your sister, the old man next door who smells like boiled onions, and regret. The plague may not have hit your village yet, but its RSVP is definitely in the mail. This is 14th century France, which means you live in a hut that's barely big enough for its contents: 6 people, 1 goat, a bag of turnips. In disappointment, there's no chimney, just a hole in the roof that also lets in rain, smoke, birds, and, on occasion, the neighbor's cat. Privacy isn't a concept. Your sister sleeps 5 feet away. Your mother is boiling something unidentifiable. Your uncle is probably relieving himself in a bucket behind the door. Which brings us to the important difference between you and literally every Disney princess. Your marriage didn't come with a castle. It came with livestock, shame, and a priest who looked mildly nauseous. Your dowry, 1 chicken and a wooden comb with half its teeth missing. And now that you're a widow, you get to keep 1/3 of the chicken. You still wear your wedding dress, though it's brown, itchy, and smells like smoke and onions. Technically, it's just your regular dress that someone tied a strip of cloth around. White isn't a thing yet. White fabric stains faster than gossip in a village. Instead, you wear what you always wear: wool, patched a dozen times, and thick enough to make sure you sweat through it and still freeze. Now, here's the kicker. Being married to a dead man might actually improve your standing. That's right, because you followed through. Because you sealed the deal, even with a corpse, you're now seen as virtuous, honorable. Not some flighty girl with loose morals. The marriage, however bizarre, saves you from social doom. And social doom in 1348 isn't just gossip. It's everything. It's whether your neighbor lends you oats or spits in your direction. Whether the village priest offers you a blessing or mutters under his breath. Whether anyone wants to marry you again, or just lets you rot unmarried like old cheese in the sun. You step outside into the biting wind. It smells like wet hay and someone else's fire. The dirt road outside your hut is already a parade of other people's problems. One woman chasing a chicken, another hauling water, a small child crying because he just learned what lunch isn't going to be. You don't say much. Your mouth still tastes like wool and worry, but you stand straighter now. You're not just a peasant girl. You're a widow, a married woman, even if your husband is now compost. And in this world, that's power, not love, not happiness, just power wrapped in a black veil. So you trudge toward the well, balancing a dented pail and the knowledge that, somehow, marrying a corpse was your best move this week. You walk back from the well, cold water sloshing against the side of the bucket and onto your skirt. Because, of course, it's got a hole in it. One more thing you won't fix. Because who has time when your dead husband's paperwork is more alive than he is? Welcome to the part where the marriage to a corpse isn't even the strangest part of your day. It's the reason for the marriage that really breaks the brain. Here's the reality: Etienne didn't have to survive to become your husband. He just had to be your fiancé long enough for the village to notice, the church to nod, and the paperwork to be almost finished. If he died a few weeks earlier, you'd be a scandal, a social embarrassment, a girl who slept too close to the fence, as the gossips would say. But now you're something much more valuable, a respectable widow. That's the point of this whole grim little ritual. You're not marrying Etienne because you love him, or even because you miss him. You're marrying him because it's better than the alternative. You see, if you'd been engaged and he died before the wedding, any child you bore, even his, would be labeled illegitimate. And in the 14th century, that's about as socially acceptable as licking coins during a plague outbreak. The church, surprisingly, is somewhat chill about this. If the couple was betrothed, the banns were read, and both families agreed. A posthumous marriage could be allowed to go through. A priest would officiate, sometimes standing next to a body, sometimes just pretending it was there. You say the vows. You sign the paper. Voila, legally married to someone whose last words were probably, "I think I just need a nap." Here's your mainstream fact. The practice of mariage posthume in medieval France, while rare, served as a social and legal tool. It protected property rights, inheritance claims, and the reputations of families who had invested time, livestock, and money into a union that was rudely interrupted by mortality. And now, the fringe fact in at least one bizarre case recorded centuries later, but echoed by earlier examples. A woman petitioned to marry her fiancé after he was executed for crimes against the crown. Her argument that they'd planned to wed, and that by marrying his corpse, she could restore his honor and secure her own status. The king approved. The body was brought out for a legal, though not exactly lively ceremony. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were driven by genuine emotion or simply social necessity. Was it love law, or was it something in between, a cultural coping mechanism for a world where death came faster than wedding feasts could be planned? In your case, it doesn't really matter what your heart feels. What matters is that your name is now clean, your family's reputation is intact, and you might inherit a piece of Etienne's meager belongings. His boots, perhaps. His belt. Certainly not his debts. You hope? Though that'll be another village debate. You return home to find your mother sewing a mourning veil. Not because she's sad. She's just glad you didn't disgrace the family. "He may be dead," she mutters, "but at least he died after agreeing to marry you." Comforting. You sit by the fire, trying to get warm. Someone hands you a bowl of pottage turnip paste, as usual, with a hint of whatever we scraped off the side of the pot. You sip in silence and wonder, as steam curls around your face, what your wedding day would have been like if Etienne hadn't coughed himself into history. Would he have smiled? Would you have been nervous? Would you have cared? But none of that happened. All that mattered was this: you wore the veil. You said the words. And you're now married in the eyes of the law, the village, and possibly a very confused priest. You didn't marry for love. You married because not marrying would have been worse. And in the 14th century, that's what romance looks like. You thought the hard part was over. You said the vows. You wore the veil. You stood beside a dead man and smiled like you weren't internally screaming. But now comes the part no one warns you about: the paperwork. Because in 14th century France, even your grief gets notarized. The village scribe has a hunchback, a bad attitude, and a quill that drips more ink than words. He sits behind a lopsided table near the church and smells like boiled cabbage and moldy parchment. And now he's shoving a thick page at you, because being legally married to a corpse doesn't just happen. It has to be approved. Here's how it works first. Someone, usually your family, petitions the local authorities for what's essentially a retroactive marriage license. You explain that the wedding would have happened, the vows were intended, and the only problem is that the groom is no longer breathing. Seems minor, just a formality. The bishop's office might send someone to verify that the couple had plans. Witnesses will be called, and sometimes the king himself gets involved. Nothing says romance like a royal seal and a witness list made up of livestock owners. Your mainstream fact: posthumous marriages had to pass through layers of local and sometimes royal bureaucracy. The ceremony might be blessed by the church, but the legalities had to be airtight because property, inheritance, and legitimacy were at stake. And in a century where most people couldn't read, the people who could read were the ones who got to decide whether you were legally respectable or morally ruined. And that brings us to the fringe tidbit in one account. A French bishop presided over a wedding in which the dead groom's body was dressed in full ceremonial clothing, propped upright in a chair, and seated at the altar. The bride said her vows. Someone tied a ribbon between their wrists, and a ring was carefully forced onto the deceased's hand. The bishop blessed the union and promptly went home to wash his hands, possibly with holy water. Now, historians still argue whether such elaborate corpse-inclusive weddings were symbolic, or if they were local flourishes added for drama or dignity. In some cases, the body was omitted entirely, and the ceremony was performed with a sword, cloak, or empty chair representing the deceased. But some records suggest at least a few weddings involved. Full attendance. You glance at the form in front of you. It's written in medieval French, which means even if you could read, you'd still need divine help to understand it. There are sections for dowry, property, family signatures, and a box that literally reads, "State of groom, deceased." That part's been ticked already. How thoughtful. You dip the quill in the ink. The scribe tells you to sign. You hesitate, not because you're having second thoughts. Those left the building when Etienne did, but because the pen smells suspiciously like onion water. You sign anyway, and just like that, you're legally and spiritually bonded to someone who now technically lives in a wooden box outside town. You're given a copy of the record, which you will never read again because you can't. But you tuck it into your bag as if it were treasure, because in a way, it is. It means no one can call you ruined. It means your children, if there are any, will not be marked. It means your next husband, should he be fortunate enough to survive the flu, won't have to explain your situation at dinner parties, or whatever counts as a dinner party when food is mostly boiled weeds. You leave the church office with a paper, a new legal status, and a quiet ache you're not sure belongs to grief or relief. Probably both. You're a widow now, an honest woman, a person of paperwork. It doesn't matter that your husband was cold before the wedding even started. He's yours. And now, the law agrees. It's been a few days. Or a week. Time doesn't exactly flow when the person you just married is already underground. Still, the village has moved on. And now so must you. That means accepting a new identity, widow. Which is strange, considering your entire marriage lasted about the length of a bread crust left on the windowsill. But here's the real kicker. In this century, being a widow is far better than being a never-married woman. Widows are respected, pitied, yes, but respected. You're now wrapped in black wool, draped in the authority of grief, and no longer anyone's social problem. You've crossed the finish line of womanhood with a technically completed marriage. No one dares question you now. Your mainstream fact in 14th century France, a widow had more freedom than a single or married woman. You could own a bit of land, run a small business, refuse a second husband if you played your cards right. Legally. Your status gave you more leverage, though, emotionally. You might just be permanently confused. And now, the odd detail of the week in one documented case. A woman who married her dead fiancé later married his brother twice. That's not a typo. The brother died. She remarried him again, which raises both eyebrows and serious questions about curses, poor luck, and the family's ability to keep men alive for more than a few winters. Historians still argue whether this was an act of devotion, desperation, or simply someone running out of eligible options. You're not in a rush to remarry. After all, you're still attending your own wedding funeral in your dreams. But your family, they're already making suggestions. The baker's son, that widower with 3 goats and a temper, the apprentice gravedigger, who at least has job security, but for now. You enjoy the strange perks of widowhood. You're allowed to say no to things, to people, to small talk. You can sit quietly in the corner and no one thinks you're antisocial. They think you're mourning, even if you're really just enjoying the first peace you've had in years. The villagers look at you differently now. The boys don't whistle. The women don't whisper. They nod, solemnly, like you've joined an elite club with terrible entry requirements. At church, you kneel on the hard stone floor with your black veil pulled forward. The prayers drone on, but your mind wanders. You think about how fast things changed. One moment, you were sewing a new veil. The next, you were watching that veil soak up candle smoke beside a casket. There's a faint dignity in it now. People assume you were in love, that you and Etienne were tragically separated. You don't correct them. Because we barely spoke, and then he died, doesn't make for great storytelling. Besides, isn't grief always a little performative? You begin to understand the social script. Wear black for a year, sigh when his name is mentioned, occasionally touch your chest as if your heart still aches. All of which is easier than explaining that your wedding kiss never happened because the groom's lips were already blue. And yet, you do miss something. Not him, but the possibility of him. A future that was supposed to come and didn't. The security, the vague warmth of routine, the illusion of choice. Instead, you got a ring, a document, and an honorary seat at the adult table. You walk home past fields, half flooded and half frozen. A neighbor waves. You nod. No one says I'm sorry, they say. You were strong, which in medieval France is code for you didn't scream in public. So here you are, a wife who never shared a bed, a widow who never shared a life, legally married, socially safe, emotionally suspended. And as the sky darkens again and smoke curls from crooked chimneys, you understand something rare. You got the title without the man, and for now, that's enough. The bells ring again, not for you this time, but for another wedding. A real one, if we're using that term generously. The groom is alive. Barely. He's missing most of his teeth and smells like he bathes once per moon cycle. But his pulse is confirmed. You stand in the back of the church, your widow's veil hiding your expression. You are what people call experienced, even though your marriage could fit on a teaspoon. Here's where things get especially ironic. Love is not required. It never was. Not for you. And not for the bride currently trembling at the altar as her father hands her over like livestock with emotions. In 14th century France, marriage is about survival, about alliances, about what you bring, what you carry, what your womb can produce. A beating heart is optional. Consent even more so. Or, your mainstream fact marriages were typically arranged by families, with the woman's opinion considered about as important as the opinion of the family goat. It was normal, expected for girls to be married as early as 12, especially if the dowry was sorted. And if your intended happened to die before the ceremony, no problem. Just marry him anyway. That way, your purity isn't questioned, your dowry isn't wasted, and everyone still gets to pretend things went according to plan. The fringe tidbit. In some cases, the entire community helped organize a posthumous marriage, especially if it involved land, alliances, or scandal prevention. There's one tale, half record, half gossip of a village in Normandy that staged a full wedding to a deceased blacksmith because he'd impregnated a local girl before dying of a car accident. The ceremony included bells, bread, and a small wake. The ring was tied to the girl's finger with twine. The guests cried, mostly from the smoke. Historians still argue whether these posthumous marriages were acts of agency or desperation. Did women agree to them to preserve their dignity, or because the alternatives shunning? Poverty, ostracism were worse. Was it empowerment through ritual, or entrapment in legal costume? You're not sure. Maybe both. You leave the wedding and walk slowly through the village. Children dart between carts. A butcher curses at a dog. Someone's soup has caught fire. Again, you take it all in with a widow's calm. That soft immunity that lets you observe without participating. But people still look at you. Men, too. They see the veil, the past tense husband, the implication that you are available again, respectable, broken in, but not broken. One man, Etienne's cousin, has already made a quiet comment about starting again. You smiled, politely, and then walked away before your expression turned impolite. At home, your mother is darning socks. She glances up and says, "You'll have another chance. You're still young?" You nod, though the word chance feels poorly chosen. Chance would imply that you ever had a say. You sit near the fire. Your veil hangs on a hook, heavy with dust. You pull out the marriage document, creased, smudged, barely legible, and read your name next to Etienne's. He didn't sign. Of course, the priest did that for him. In death, the groom is silent. In life, the bride is too. The truth is, no one really wants your opinion, just your agreement. And when you gave it, when you said yes, beside a dead man, you followed the script. You kept your place. Still, something stirs inside you. Not rebellion. Exactly. Not yet. But the awareness that the next time they ask for your consent, they might not get the same answer. You may not have chosen Etienne. You may not choose the next man either. But you've learned something powerful. Silence is what they expect, which means your voice, when you find it, will be loud enough to crack the bell tower. The sun never really rises here. It just changes the color of the fog. And today, as you step out with your bucket and your breath clouds the air, the ground crunches beneath your feet, not from frost, but from another round of dried parchment fluttering through the village square. Someone has died. Someone is suing someone else. Someone forgot to pay a tax on wheat. Again. But today, the notice is for you. Because death, it turns out, is not the end of legal obligations. You glance at the official wax seal with something between confusion and dread. Apparently, Etienne owed a portion of land taxes, or borrowed grain from a neighbor, or had a cousin who now claims half your dowry because his cow once chewed the corner of your wedding veil. It's vague, it's absurd, and it's all legally binding. Your mainstream fact. In medieval France, marriage, even posthumous marriage, brought with it a web of legal consequences. Debts could pass to spouses. Land ownership shifted. Children's legitimacy determined inheritance. And the church. Oh, it loved a juicy debate over who was entitled to what, especially if you, the widow, were just barely literate and too polite to scream during confession. The fringe gem today, in at least one historical case, a woman married her dead betrothed, gave birth a few months later, and then had to petition the court to have the child declared legitimate. The judge agreed after a minor theological debate on when a soul enters the body, and whether a widowed virgin counts as technically deflowered. Historians still argue whether this ruling was a merciful exception or a clever clerical miracle. You tuck the notice into your apron and head to the scribe. Again, he's less grumpy today, probably because someone finally brought him a new quill. Or wine, possibly both. He reads the paper, squints, and informs you that yes, your marriage is still legally valid, which means your responsibilities are too. But don't worry, he says cheerfully, at least you're not on trial for heresy. Small comforts. You sit down at his crooked desk and begin the process of defending yourself. Again, no, you didn't know about the debt. Yes, you married Etienne after his death. No, you didn't hide his boots. Yes, you understand you are now liable for at least 3 chickens worth of back rent. You signed something, you're not sure what, but the scribe seems satisfied. So you take that as a win. And this is your life now. The marriage was supposed to be a conclusion. A sad, weird, socially approved conclusion. But instead, it's a beginning of paperwork, of tax demands, of inheritance squabbles involving goats and turnips. A neighbor wants Etienne's hammer. A cousin wants the blanket he died under. Someone else insists he loaned them a mug in 1346 and would like it back. Please, it's exhausting. Not in a dramatic, weeping by the fire kind of way, but in the quiet drip of daily indignity. You lose time arguing with officials, fetching signatures, proving again and again that your very strange wedding was not a hallucination, but a bureaucratically sanctioned event. You're not a fraud. You're just unlucky. And as the weeks pass, you notice something else. You're not alone. You start hearing whispers from other women. One who married her lover after he died in a car accident. One whose betrothed was trampled by pigs the day before their ceremony. One who said the vows beside a coffin and then buried the memory under layers of linen and silence. You see them in church, in the market, at the well. You nod at each other. Widows by choice, by accident, by desperate decree. No one talks about it out loud, but when your eyes meet, it's like a secret handshake made entirely of sighs. And that's how you survive the next round of legal nonsense. Not through rage or rebellion, but through quiet endurance, sharpened like a blade hidden in your bodice. You are not just a widow. You are a witness, a walking loophole with a bucket and a growing list of unpaid grain tabs. You married death, but life, apparently, still wants your signature. You would think the absurdity ends there. You've said the vows, filled out the paperwork, dodged debt collectors, and perfected the half smile of someone who's both socially protected and legally entangled. But now comes the part no one warns you about the ceremony's long shadow. Because in some corners of the kingdom, posthumous marriage isn't just a legal affair. It's a public one, with garlands, guests, and a groom who can't blink. The bells toll again, not for a funeral, not for a wedding, but for both. You attend the event because your cousin is involved. Her betrothed was struck by lightning while climbing onto a roof to impress her. Not the best meet-cute ending. And now, a week later, the village has decided they should still marry. He's been embalmed, sort of, mostly just wrapped in linen, with herbs stuffed into unpleasant places. His nose is caved slightly, but otherwise presentable. You sit in the back pew and watch. The priest clears his throat so many times. You think he's stalling. The bride walks down the aisle in borrowed black. The coffin sits upright by the altar, propped like a nobleman watching from the best seat in the house. A sword has been laid across it, symbolic, sharp, and deeply awkward. Here's your mainstream fact in some posthumous weddings, especially those with noble or legal significance. The ceremony took place as if the groom were still alive. A priest would recite the vows, sometimes directly to the body, and the bride would respond accordingly. Witnesses stood by. In rare cases, rings were exchanged. A ribbon might be tied between hand and coffin. And yes, people cried, sometimes from sadness, sometimes from the smell. The fringe fact: there are scattered accounts of ceremonies involving not just the body, but full ritual elements, funeral chants blending into nuptial prayers, a wedding feast held next to the grave, even a final kiss placed on the forehead of the deceased. One witness described it as a wedding of flesh to shadow. Another called it an act of mercy or madness. Historians still argue whether these hybrid ceremonies served more to honor the dead or to protect the living from shame and social chaos. Your cousin doesn't cry. She stares straight ahead, lips pressed into a line that says she's somewhere between resignation and resolve. The priest mumbles through the Latin. When the vows are done, he places a thin circlet of silver on her finger and gently touches the edge of the coffin. There's a moment of silence so complete. You hear the wind slip through the broken church window. Then, just like that, it's over. The guests file outside, unsure whether to cheer or cross themselves. Someone awkwardly throws herbs in the air. A goat eats half a wreath. Your cousin walks home with the ribbon still tied to her wrist. You follow at a distance. Later, over watery soup, she says. Well, at least now I won't be questioned, because that's what this was all about. Not romance, not grief, just a very public guarantee of her moral safety. She did the right thing. She stood by her betrothed, even when rigor mortis did too. And as the candles gutter out and you sit quietly in your corner, you realize you're not just witnessing these ceremonies. You're part of a growing tradition, a society that pretends death doesn't interrupt destiny, that clings to the ceremony like a shield. You pull your own wedding ribbon from the drawer. It's frayed, faded, still faintly smells of rose water and dust. You tuck it away again, carefully, because while your husband rests in the churchyard, your reputation still walks the village paths. And in the 14th century, that's the real afterlife. The months pass like melting wax, slow, silent, and inevitable. You go about your life with your hands full and your eyes half open. Sometimes you forget you're married. Sometimes you forget he's dead. And sometimes you forget there was ever a difference. Your widow's veil is fraying at the edge now, not from grief, but from wear. It brushes your shoulders as you stir the pot, feed the chickens, or fetch water from the same well where everyone shares gossip and parasites in equal measure. Etienne is gone, but your marriage, it's still there, like a stubborn stain on the church floor, quiet, dried, and impossible to scrub out. Your mainstream fact, even after the ceremony is over and the paperwork is sealed, your status as a posthumously married woman follows you for life. You are recognized by the church as a legitimate spouse and therefore expected to act like one. You inherit only what the village agrees on, are bound by your virtue, and often used as an example to younger girls. Look at her, they say. She did the right thing, even when it was awful. What they don't say is that the right thing felt more like a trap than a triumph. The fringe detail. There are scattered references, half whispers in church registers of women who wore rings from their dead husbands for decades. Some refused to remarry. Others kept a small carved token of their beloved near their bed, sometimes beneath the pillow. A few left letters tucked behind altar stones, speaking to men who could no longer listen. Historians still argue whether these women clung to love, to duty, or simply to the only narrative that gave their lives structure in a world that rarely gave women a voice. You, though you're pragmatic, you know Etienne was a promise, not a person, a ritual, not a romance. You barely knew him. You remember his cough more than his smile, but still he gave you a name, a place, legal shelter, even if he did it posthumously, involuntarily, and while lying very, very still. Now, years later, you've remarried, a living man this time, mostly quiet, not too cruel, and good with his hands. He doesn't ask about Etienne. You never bring it up. But there are moments when you see a certain herb in a basket, or hear a certain chant in Mass, where you remember the day you said, "I do" to a coffin. Your new children don't know about it. They think your widow's veil was from your sister. They don't ask why the ribbon in your drawer is tied into a perfect loop. and hidden beneath a folded parchment you never show. You sometimes think about other women, the ones who kissed foreheads that no longer felt warm, the ones who stood by graves reciting vows, or cried, not because they were heartbroken, but because it all felt so absurd, so performative, so necessary. You understand them now, deeply and late at night. As the fire dims and the wind makes the shutters creak, you let yourself feel it all. The strangeness, the weight, the bitter comedy of marrying someone who couldn't even hold the ring. But here's the softest truth you lived. Not because the ritual protected you, but because you knew how to play the role. You followed the script until it no longer served you. And then, quietly, you rewrote the ending. Because death was not the end of your story. It was just the most unexpected beginning. Word count 794. Wane down 200 words. And now, let the past drift gently from your thoughts. You've walked a long path tonight, through misty fields, silent chapels, awkward ceremonies, and marriages that existed only because someone needed them to. You've worn the veil, signed the scrolls, stood beside the grave, and come out on the other side, still breathing. There's something strangely calming in knowing that even the strangest, most unsettling stories are part of the human puzzle. That's somewhere in medieval France, long before electricity or indoor plumbing. Someone stood just like you, confused, exhausted, wearing a dress that didn't fit, and said "I do" to a body that would never say it back. And yet, life went on. Meals were cooked. Children were born. Seasons changed. The absurd gave way to the everyday. And dignity somehow. It bloomed like a flower in the mud. So now, let your body soften. Let your thoughts dissolve like candlelight. You don't have to marry anyone. You don't have to wear black. You're not in 1348 anymore. You're just here, safe, warm, still, and tomorrow will be your own. Hey guys, tonight we shimmy into something dangerously fashionable. Tight collars, stiff sleeves, and the very real possibility that what you're wearing might just strangle you before supper. Sounds dramatic. Well, we haven't even tightened the cravat yet. You're standing in front of a gilded mirror. Morning light spills across the floor in buttery streaks. A valet hovers behind you, carefully buttoning your shirt closed to the throat. Another assistant is wrangling with the collar, 4 layers of starched linen, stiff as a biscuit and nearly as breathable. You swallow, or try to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing that. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The collar clicks into place like a mousetrap. Your Adam's apple retreats. Your breath becomes optional. But you look sharp. And that's what matters. Fashion in this era, think 18th to 19th century Europe, wasn't just about style. It was performance. And part of that performance involved looking perfectly composed while your body quietly begged for oxygen. High neck collars, especially for men, were a statement of discipline. Tight, symmetrical, towering upwards like a neck brace sent from Paris. Historians still argue whether this fashion was about elegance or control. Some believe it reflected a growing obsession with structure and posture. Others think it was just a particularly stylish death wish with bonus starch. You step back from the mirror, slowly, carefully, because moving too fast in these garments is Well, risky. The sleeves are tight too, cut close under the arm, binding at the shoulder. Raising your hand to scratch your nose could dislocate something, but you do it anyway. Fashion waits for no itch. Your valet frowns. He tugs the back of the jacket. You try to inhale again. The top button presses against your windpipe like it has a personal vendetta. Out in the hall, your shoes click sharply against the floor. The constriction across your chest makes you walk taller. Straighter mostly because slouching would cause your ribs to collapse. You pass a fellow gentleman. He nods, eyes admiring your polished look. His own collar is a pristine white wall wrapped so tightly around his neck, you wonder how he's even speaking. "Splendid morning," he says, voice 2 octaves higher than normal. "Glorious," you manage, with a wheeze that almost sounds polite. This is the strange paradox: the tighter the fit, the higher the status. Loose shirts are for the poor, the rural, the ill. Tight means tailored. Tailored means wealth. And if you faint halfway through a duel, well, at least your cravat will be wrinkle-free. You make it to breakfast. Eggs, toast, and a very dry biscuit that mocks your inability to chew without rotating your entire torso. No one eats much. Digestion requires blood flow. And blood flow is compromised when your neck has been gift-wrapped by Victorian anxiety. A lady passes by her collar is even higher. Her bodice laced so tightly her waist seems sculpted from breathlessness. She smiles faintly, but you can tell. She's counting the minutes until she can undo a single hook and remember what air feels like. And yet, this is normal, expected, enforced not just by tailors, but by society's silent code if you can't breathe. At least look good fainting. You take another bite of toast. It crumbles dryly against the roof of your mouth. A sip of tea helps, but not much. Your esophagus is under siege. By midday, you'll be used to it, mostly. Your neck will throb in that dull, quiet way that says, "I'm not broken, but I'm considering it." Still, you'll keep the collar on, because to loosen it now, that would be scandalous. You've stopped trying to turn your head, not because you don't want to, but because it's no longer physically possible without sounding like a wooden puppet, creaking at the joints. The collar is that tight. Starched linen stacked high, pressed into the shape of a capital, I running straight up your spine. You try to glance left. Nothing. Try again. You manage a slight shoulder roll instead, like a shrug got halfway through and gave up. It's oddly theatrical, really, like living inside a costume from a play where everyone is pretending to be fine while secretly calculating how long they can hold their breath before their vision starts to blur. You're playing your role beautifully. The cravat, the innocent-sounding ribbon of death doesn't help. Wrapped tightly, tied like origami under your chin, and secured with a pin sharper than your wit at this point. It looks dashing, daring, even, but also like something designed by someone who actively hated necks. And yet, it's the height of fashion. This is the Regency period's love letter to restraint. Elegance was measured in lines, clean ones, straight ones, vertical ones that made your body look like it had been molded out of posture and panic. And the neck. Oh, the neck became prime real estate. Historians still argue whether the cravat and collar were more about social class or moral discipline. Some say it showed a gentleman's control over his body, his breathing, his baser instincts. Others insist it was just a 19th century version of a peacock's plume. Big, flashy, and mostly useless. Either way, here you are, practicing the fine art of nodding without nodding, smiling without moving your jaw too far, speaking with your lips like you've just left the dentist. At the opera, you're seated in the front row, great for visibility, bad for the kind of stiff-backed, shallow breath poise your outfit requires. When the soprano hits her high note, you try to clap, But your sleeves are so snug. Your elbows only make it halfway up before stopping in protest. You pat your hands gently against your thighs instead. It's enough. During intermission, a gentleman in a crimson waistcoat stumbles near the corridor and grabs at his neck. Just a little faintness. He gasps, like he's apologizing to the wallpaper. 2 servants help him to a chair. His cravat is loosened slightly, not undone. Heavens no, but just enough for color to return to his cheeks. The rest of you pretend not to notice. You sip your sherry and look at the paintings instead, because to acknowledge his collapse would be to admit that it could happen to you. And that's the unspoken rule of tight fashion we suffer in secret. Like heroes or fools. You recall your own close call last summer, an outdoor garden party. 30 degrees under the sun, and a cravat that absorbed heat like a stovepipe. You spent the entire afternoon with a smile frozen on your face, and the internal monologue of I might perish, but at least I'll perish coordinated. The worst part? You'd do it again. Because nothing says refinement like immobility. Your maid, when you return home, helps you out of the jacket. You exhale long, slow, like your ribs just re-entered society. She unties the cravat carefully, and you feel the sudden rush of blood returning to your brain. It's dizzying. You giggle, not out of joy, but from oxygen. Your neck has survived another day. Collar didn't win. Not entirely. But tomorrow, you'll wake up and put it all back on. Because in this world, tightness equals status. A loose collar might as well be a loose reputation, and you're not ready to risk either. You try to reach for the teacup, and your arm refuses to cooperate. Not entirely your hand moves. Sure, but only in a narrow arc like you're doing a slow-motion sword flourish. The tight sleeves of your coat cinch just below the shoulder, yanking the seam taut and locking your upper arm like a marionette string pulled too tight. You pretend it's intentional, elegant, restrained, but your biscuit remains tragically undunked. Sleeves in this era, particularly in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, are less about covering your arms and more about compressing them into velvet sausages. Fashion dictates they be cut so tightly across the biceps and underarm that lifting anything heavier than a fan becomes an athletic pursuit. And forget about reaching above your head. The very idea is laughable. Historians still argue whether sleeve constriction was purely a visual aesthetic or served some deeper symbolic function. Some claim it was a modesty signal, subtly discouraging expressive gestures, physical labor, or mobility in general. Others argue it was just poor tailoring decisions that no one wanted to be the first to undo. But either way, here you are, sitting upright, pinned like a butterfly in formal wear. You shift in your seat, trying to relieve some of the pressure under your arms. A seam pinches back. Your ribs protest. There's a moment, just a moment, where you worry a thread might pop. It doesn't. You thank the stitch gods and freeze again. At the table, others move just as carefully. The lady next to you has sleeves so tight they leave faint red lines on her forearms. When she reaches for her handkerchief, she does it with a slow precision as of a chess move. Every gesture is deliberate, restrained, rehearsed. Even the teacup seems smaller, as if they too have adjusted to fashion's constraints. Later, during a stroll through the garden, someone tells the story of Lady Bessington fainting mid-waltz because her sleeves were so snug. They impeded her circulation. The crowd laughs, but you can't help noticing they all glance down at their own arms, subtly flexing, testing, because the story might be funny, but it's also a warning. You touch your upper arm gently through the fabric. It's warm, slightly numb, not enough to panic, but enough to remember that comfort is no longer part of the equation. The tailor you used Monsieur Arpin once mentioned with pride that his sleeves are cut just tight enough to remind you you're being held. A hug. He called it a velvet hug from fashion. You're pretty sure hugs aren't supposed to cause nerve compression. Your personal low point came last winter. A jacket made from thick brocade, layered with silk piping and gold trim. Beautiful. Opulent. Completely incapable of allowing your elbows to bend more than 30 degrees. You spent the entire evening drinking wine through a straw and nodding while your limbs hung useless at your sides like ornamental fenders. Someone commented you looked serenely composed. You were just trying not to pass out from blood flow restriction. You pass a mirror now, an elegant, gold leaf-framed thing in the hallway, and pause. Your reflection is pristine, sleeves smooth, posture impeccable, not a wrinkle in sight. You look expensive, and you wonder, quietly, what version of yourself has been sewn into this silhouette, because that person can't clap, can't reach, can barely raise their arms, but they can enter a room like they own every chandelier in it. You continue your walk, arms swinging stiffly at your sides like a wind-up doll. The wind shifts slightly. Your sleeve tightens at the elbow. You smile and pretend not to notice, because the only thing worse than being strangled by fashion is being seen adjusting it. It starts with a gasp, a quiet, sharp sound like a hiccup caught halfway out of the throat. You turn your head just slightly painfully, thanks to the collar, and you see her Lady Elowen standing by the garden arch, her gloved fingers pressing against the lace-covered hollow of her throat. She sways. One delicate heel lifts off the gravel as if to flee the moment, but she doesn't make it far. Her knees fold like card tables, and she drops in slow motion, graceful, even in collapse. A servant rushes to catch her. There's a flurry of skirts, hands, and murmurs, and no one dares loosen the collar. You watch from a distance, not because you're indifferent, but because you know the rules. To unhook a lady's high-necked lace collar in public is to breach the sacred boundaries of fashion and modesty. It's like undressing her, even if she can't breathe. Eventually, someone dares to undo the top clasp. Just one, a tiny pop of fabric. The lace slackens. You swear you can hear her inhale. She'll be fine. They say it's not the first time this kind of thing happens. The reality her dress was killing her. You walk away, heart thumping a little harder than before, because you felt it too, that tightening, that dizzy, pulsing buzz at the edge of your vision when the fabric presses just a bit too firmly into your arteries. That line between well-fitted and oxygen-deprived is narrower than the hem on your cuffs. Historians still argue whether incidents like Lady Elowen's were exaggerated for dramatic flair or genuinely frequent. Some letters describe women fainting during services, collapsing in carriages, even dying quietly in their dressing rooms, all with suspiciously pristine collars still buttoned tight. Others suggest these stories were cautionary tales spun by those who favored looser silhouettes. But the fact remains, it happened. And you know why. You remember the last ball. The high ruffled collar you wore white silk, lined with whalebone reeds to keep it upright. It dug into the soft flesh beneath your jaw every time you turned your head. You didn't eat much, didn't laugh too hard, didn't breathe past your collarbone. But no one noticed, because the goal wasn't comfort, it was elegance. You looked stunning in the portraits. You nearly passed out in the antechamber. But oh, the compliments. Tonight, though the mood has shifted, after Lady Elowen's collapse, the women move a little more slowly. The men loosen their cuffs an extra notch. A quiet awareness settles into the evening air, like everyone's secretly wondering, will it be me next? You slip away early. Back in your dressing room, you stare at your reflection. The collar is exquisite, embroidered, scalloped, structured, a masterpiece. And yet, when your fingers reach up and undo that first hook, Your breath comes rushing back like a tide. Your chest rises. Your shoulders fall. The mirror version of you doesn't change, but the feeling does. You are still beautiful. You are also alive. The collar lands on the chaise in a heap of folded silence, and for the first time in hours, your neck feels like it belongs to you. They call it the garrote waistcoat. You laugh the first time you hear it. Surely it's a joke. A waistcoat so tight it strangles. Sounds like something your tailor would mutter if you complained about fit again. But then, someone tells you about Lord Wyndham. Collapsed at his writing desk, face flushed, lips blue, waistcoat cinched so perfectly that he couldn't even slump forward. They had to cut it off. He'd insisted on the tightest fit possible. Something about presentation, something about posture. His manservant warned him. The doctor had warned him, but vanity won. Well, vanity and fashion. You stare at your own waistcoat now. It's a rich plum velvet with delicate embroidery across the chest. The buttons are strained like they're holding back a small rebellion. You exhale, and the middle one tugs. You inhale, and your ribs whisper, "Don't do that again." Historians still debate whether the term garrote waistcoat was an exaggeration, something coined by pamphleteers or satirical writers looking to mock the gentry. Others insist these garments genuinely restricted airflow and could, in rare cases, contribute to fainting or worse, especially when paired with already tight collars and nerve-pinching jackets. You lean against a wall near the dining room and try not to faint. Dinner is served. You don't eat much. Again, the pressure around your midsection is constant, like someone gently but firmly hugging your lungs. You take shallow sips of wine, small bites of souffle. The gentleman next to you jokes about undoing a button. Everyone chuckles. No one moves. Because the illusion is what matters. The illusion of ease, of elegance, of a body entirely sculpted by silk and tension. You remember last spring's garden wedding? You wore a tailored ensemble so snug. You couldn't bend to retrieve your dropped handkerchief. You had to gesture subtly until someone picked it up for you. Your spine stayed ruler straight the entire day, not from discipline, but because the seams wouldn't let you fold. And the compliments. Oh, how commanding you looked. Yes, because your back couldn't curve, and your breath came in half doses. They meant it as praise. You took it as survival. Later that evening, a man at the edge of the ballroom lost his balance and collapsed backward, still in his chair. His waistcoat had been altered last minute. His valet said it was an inch too tight, but he'd insisted. It's only 1 inch, he'd said. Sometimes 1 inch is the difference between poise and pressure point. You listen closely now when people mention fit. You hear the hesitation beneath the bragging. You nod, smile, and silently count the number of steps between you and the exit just in case you need fresh air. Tonight, you return home with aching ribs. The valet helps you peel off the waistcoat. You take the deepest breath you've had all day. It shudders a little at the end. You wonder how long you've been wearing pain, like it was part of the outfit. And you wonder, too, how many others still are. The pamphlet sits discreetly on your desk, folded neatly, barely larger than your palm. The title scrawled in conservative, almost apologetic script. A brief treatise on the health risks of contemporary tailoring. You flip it open with 2 fingers, already wary of what you'll find. No pictures, just text. Dry, detailed, quietly damning. A surgeon anonymous, of course, has listed the growing evidence. Collars compressing the jugular, sleeves leading to radial nerve compression, waistcoats obstructing diaphragmatic motion. There's even a line that mentions sudden death brought on by arterial collapse due to formal wear constriction. You chuckle, then stop, because you remember last week standing during an entire 2-hour funeral. Collar stiff as penance, chest bound so tightly in a ceremonial jacket that your heartbeat felt like it was echoing through your ears. You nearly saw stars by the end, and you weren't even grieving the deceased. You were grieving your oxygen. Historians still argue whether such medical concerns were taken seriously in their time. Some say the warnings were widely ignored, brushed off as prudish or alarmist. Others believe certain doctors subtly shaped fashion by designing looser options under the guise of modern tailoring. But either way, most people, especially the elite, chose their silhouette over their safety. You refold the pamphlet and slide it into a drawer. You won't throw it away. You're not that dismissive. But you're also not about to cancel your next fitting. Later, at a soiree, you overhear a conversation between two young men near the refreshment table. "I saw a physician," one says, adjusting his cravat, "who told me my collar's pressing directly on my carotid artery." The other nods, impressed. "Ah, so it's working." They laugh. You laugh too, but quietly, because somewhere beneath the laughter is a common understanding. We're all pretending this is fine. You can see it in the subtle fidgets, the way someone slowly loosens their sleeve buttons when they think no one's watching. The woman who sips her champagne while leaning slightly sideways, not for style, but because her bodice won't let her sit straight after dessert. You catch your reflection in the mirrored wall, impeccable, dashing, and ever so slightly gray at the temples. Or maybe that's just the lighting, or the lightheadedness. Either way, you look good. That's what counts, right? Someone approaches Lady Rivenhall, clad in an ivory gown with a neckline so high and tight, it may as well have been designed by a boa constrictor. "You look well," she says, blinking slowly. Her voice is airy, too airy. You nod, and you look radiant, though slightly underventilated. She smirks. "I call it seasonal suffocation." You laugh. Genuinely this time. The music starts. A waltz. People pair off. You hesitate. Dancing in your current attire would be like performing acrobatics in a corset. But you step forward anyway. Smile. Offer your arm. Because appearance, as always, takes the lead. Halfway through the first turn, your sleeve digs into the crook of your elbow. The collar presses tighter with every spin. Your breath comes faster, but also shallower. It's like being slowly hugged by a very stylish snake. Still, you don't stop. The music carries you forward, as does pride, because while the surgeons may warn, the fashion speaks louder. You sit alone in the reading room, the fire hissing gently, pages fluttering between your gloved fingers. Your collar is looser tonight just slightly. A single button left open at the throat, hidden by a carefully folded cravat. You feel scandalous and free, not free enough to exhale entirely, but close. The subtle rebellion, stitched in silence. You're not the only one. Of course, the signs are multiplying. At Tuesday's dinner, Miss Langley wore sleeves with a hint of puff at the shoulder, not the strangling tubes of seasons past. And young Everett came in with a jacket that dared to bend at the elbow. You notice these things now. Tiny seams of resistance opening up in the cloth. Historians still argue whether these changes came from bold fashion innovators or simply exhausted bodies reaching their limit. Maybe both. Maybe one led to the other. What they agree on, though, is that by the late 19th century, the grip of fashion loosened. Just a touch. Just enough. It starts like this: small decisions. A slightly relaxed hem. A collar cut with half an inch more mercy. People say nothing, but they notice. You lean back, testing the new jacket you've commissioned. It's made from a softer wool, shaped still but kinder. Your arms move freely, relatively. Your lungs feel less like decorative accessories. The tailor called it a modern cut. You'd nearly kissed him. The change isn't without risk. Last week, at a garden party, A woman in a looser neckline was politely snubbed by a marchioness. Too relaxed. The old woman hissed behind a napkin, as if she's off to milk goats. But that woman smiled, and ate, and danced, and later removed her gloves entirely. You'd never seen her so radiant. You think of your own turning point, not dramatic, but memorable. A spring walk, alone, collar open, coat unbuttoned. The breeze actually touched your skin. You felt like a person, not a mannequin. You told no one. But something shifted after that. Now, you look at fashion not as a command, but a conversation, one you can push back against, whisper to, negotiate with. Tonight, your valet pauses when dressing you. His fingers hover over the top button. You meet his eyes in the mirror. Leave it, you say softly. He nods. And for the first time in years, you descend the staircase feeling dressed and alive. The museum is quiet this morning. You stroll past the glass cases slowly, hands behind your back, collar comfortably folded open. A school group passes by, their guide gesturing toward a display labeled 19th century men's formal wear. Inside, a tight waistcoat, an aggressively stiff high collar, and a pair of sleeves so narrow they could double as corset laces. The guide laughs. Can you imagine wearing that every day? The children wrinkle their noses. One mimics choking. Another says he'd rather wear pajamas forever. You smile faintly, because you can imagine. You've been that display, lived in it, buttoned, stitched, bound, and breathless. And now, looking at it through glass, you feel two things: relief and tenderness. The mannequin in the case stands impossibly tall, perfect posture, chin raised, expression neutral. But you know the story behind that look. The shallow breaths, the careful angles, the fainting spells politely ignored, and the faint voices that dared to ask, must we really suffer to be seen? Historians still argue whether those final decades of constrictive fashion died out because of shifting values or just exhaustion. Some claim it was war or the rise of industrial practicality. Others say people finally grew tired of clothing that punished their bodies in service of image. You think maybe it was love for freedom, for breath, for bodies that move and stretch and bend. In the case beside the menswear is a morning dress, black, heavy, high-necked, with sleeves that taper into wrist cuffs tighter than most wristwatches today. The plaque mentions how some women wore such gowns for years, for entire chapters of their lives. You glance down at your own sleeves, soft linen, loose at the cuffs, and you realize fashion may change, but the memory of how it once felt lingers. A tight seam in history, a ghost in your wardrobe. You sit on the bench near the end of the exhibit. Breathe. No tug, no pinch, no pressure, just silence. And the soft, forgiving whisper of fabric that finally learned how to let go. Word count 1015. Wind down 300 words. So now, as the lights dim a little deeper around you, and the night presses softly at your windows, think of the generations who wore their beauty like armor stitched in tight, buttoned to the neck, sleeves like corsets for the arms. Think of the quiet gasps behind closed doors, the fingertips fumbling at hooks and stays, the long sighs released when no one was looking. And think, too, of the rebels who loosened a cuff, undid a single button, chose to breathe. Fashion may not strangle us so literally anymore, but we still carry that impulse to constrain, to impress, to endure discomfort for the sake of being seen a certain way. Maybe tonight is your collar's first pardon, maybe tomorrow. You walk into the world wearing something that lets you move, lets you rest, lets you feel like yourself uncompressed, unhidden, unstiffened. You are not a mannequin. You are not a portrait. You are a soft, warm thing made for motion and breath. And no matter what fabric wraps around you, remember, it should serve you, not silence you. So loosen the top button, let your shoulders drop, let the night air find your neck, and drift. Quietly now, into rest, no starch, no pins, no pressure, just the hum of the fan, the soft rustle of sheets, and the feeling of being completely, beautifully unbound.